Thank you for staying with the AM edition of Newsfeed. Well, Kojo Bafoe is a writer, speaker, entrepreneur, and self-proclaimed retired poet. He has published 2 collections of poetry, Voices in My Head, along with And They Say, Black Men Don't Write Love Poetry. He has edited magazines such as Blaque, Destiny, Man and Afropolitan. He has earned a reputation as a thinker, someone who lives outside the box and free of the labels that society seeks to place on us. He now joins us in studio to discuss his latest book, Listen to Your Footsteps. Kojo, great to see you. Thank you so much for coming through early on this Saturday morning.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
How much of your life did we disrupt this morning?
Well, not too much. My kids, I always say my kids let me sleep in. They're old enough to let me sleep in on a Saturday. So generally I'll just sleep in a little longer than normal. Yeah. So it's not that big a disruption.
Now, obviously, there are a number of themes that run through your book. Parenting is one of them. Walk us through some of the other themes outside of parenting.
Well, parenting is from 2 perspectives. So being a parent and having 2 children, but also being a son, because I was raised by my father and kind of, let's call it my experience of parenting. But I also explore things, creativity. I explore identity and belonging quite a bit because it was a journey for me. Growing up, and a bunch of other things that are kind of, like I throw in BE, and then I throw in writing, and I throw in something else, just because I have views on a lot of different things.
Now, one of the things you speak about is just how similar you and your father were, and that you only realized it later in life. You talked about you started working for your father at 12 years of age, or as early as that. You got fired by your dad, but you didn't pay attention to him, and you carried on as if nothing had happened. And you describe yourself as a chip off the old block. Talk to us about your relationship with your father. What are some of the lessons drawn from that, and how you've parented differently or the same? Yeah,
so particularly when you get into your 20s, you start to look at your parents and start to realize, you spend your teenage life rebelling and pushing against certain things. And then in my 20s, I realized that, personality-wise, my perspectives, also my values, the values I was raised with, were very similar to my father's. But also my character, and, I'm a bit of an introvert. I enjoy reading. That was my father. So the first part of the journey was just accepting that, You think that you're the better version, and then you discover that a lot of what you're raised with and a lot of what you're taught is at the foundation of who you are. So in terms of that carrying over to my son and my daughter, where I try to raise them the same and differently, I think it's tied to values. So it's tied to how I try to do it the same is values in terms of respect for oneself and respect for other people, acknowledging and being proud of where you come from and culture and heritage. And so I try to instill that in them and give them the tools. And in terms of, the day-to-day, having children, when I was writing this book, I feel like I'm jumping around, but when I was writing this book, we were in lockdown. And I would write something today, and 2 days, 2 days afterwards, I'd look at what I wrote and look at what I'd said to my children or something to do with our relationship, and it felt like it had changed in those 2 days. Because it's such an, it's children force you to, and if you allow them, they force you to become better. But you have to be kind of reflective. And when you're locked down and you're in the same house and everything is literally happening in real time, and I was writing in real time, I'd like to think that I've taught them certain things, and then tomorrow I'll wake up and I said something yesterday and I'll go, okay, maybe I shouldn't have done it that way. Maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. Maybe I shouldn't have, maybe I should have done this.
Now, before we leave parenting is obviously challenging as it is exciting. It's a dynamic process. In fact, you talk about learning all the time and not knowing if some of the decisions that you make are correct. Now, you have German and Ghanaian descent. You grew up quite a bit of your life in Lesotho, in Germany. Your kids, you then moved to South Africa, I think at about 27. and how are you raising your children, I suppose, is the question that I'm trying to ask. Because there are, could be potentially so many inferences to where you've come from and what you've learned and the influences in your life over the years.
So my journey in terms of understanding identity and kind of understanding who I am meant embracing all of those things. When I was younger, people used to say, you can't be on the fence, you must pick a side. And my journey has been going, actually, I don't have to pick a side, and each space is valid. So I am as proud of my Ghanaian heritage as I am of my German heritage. Lesotho raised me, and that's also my home. And I live in South Africa, therefore I have I'm vested in the country. So I pick and choose from spaces, what makes sense to me and what doesn't make sense to me. And I try to raise my children with the very same thing, is understanding that for other people it may be simple, I come from this line of people, I come from this heritage, this culture, these traditions, and it's singular. It might be easier, but at the same time for us is, they know my heritage, they also know their mother's heritage, and it's a pride in all of that. And recognizing that all of those bits and pieces actually make you who you are. And it's not just that. It's not just the, let's call it culture and tradition. Like, I grew up listening to hip-hop from a very young age, when it was about, knowledge of self. It was about the different elements. I went to a school that was a British school in Lesotho. All of those things, like literally everything you interact with has an influence on you. And the important thing is being able to find a space for it, and also discarding what doesn't make sense. And I try to live my life that way. Like, when I engage with something, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's about, okay, is there something of value in there for me personally? And that's what I try to do with my children.
Now, there's a chapter in the book towards the end called Ask for Help, and you describe life as an obstacle course in the fog. That's a pretty murky description, but in many ways could be accurate. Walk us through how you interpreted life in that way. What were those experiences that arose in you giving that definition or illustration, if you will?
I mean, look, it also ties to this idea of being in the now. And it's something that I've had to learn, and I continue to learn. Right? So, I grew up looking very much in the future. Like, I never knew what I was going to be doing tomorrow, but I always had a plan for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And what I found with that is, because we cannot predict the future, so I was totally focused on that, without focusing on what's happening right now, without focusing on kind of the steps that I'm taking now. And I find that very random things happen to me, or not happen to me, but because I also believe that we consciously or unconsciously manifest kind of what's happening around us. But it was, often it's felt like I don't know what's beyond that veil.
Yeah.
And when you're living your life trying to see beyond that veil, it can become very confusing. And the more I shifted to what's in front of me, the more I shifted what's in front of me, it became easier to deal with it. And I also write about how I believe in the one foot in front of the other, let's call it philosophy, where sometimes when things are tough, what I'll do is I don't look to the future. I literally look at what's in front of me and try and put one foot in front of the other. And eventually you find yourself, next time you look up, you realize that, oh, I've gone beyond that particular smoke screen.
Now, I'd imagine that Listen to Your Footsteps is not the most obvious of titles for a book, purely because, well, I certainly don't listen to my footsteps. However, that being said, in hindsight, I will know from a person's footsteps that, okay, when my dad was alive, okay, that's Dad, or if I was in school, that's Mr. So-and-so, or whoever it was. What inspired that title, and what do we read into it?
Hindsight is a beautiful thing, right? Yeah. So I was a sprinter, and when I was in Germany after high school, my coach always used to say, listen to your footsteps when you're running, because there's a particular cadence, there's a particular sound when you're sprinting and on the track. And, you know, I used to specialize in 100 meters, and when you start, your steps are close together and really fast because you're propelling yourself forward, and then your stride extends, and the steps start becoming kind of a little further apart. And, you know, fast forward a couple of years, I hurt my leg, and I've had multiple ups on my leg, and I had a muscle removed, and because of that, I had what's called drop foot. So the muscle that keeps my foot up was removed. So I used to have to wear a prosthetic support. So my foot just used to hang. And then when I walked, it would slap. And because this had been so ingrained in me from my coach, I would hear the slap when I walk. And so I'd have bad leg days. And I had ups and muscle transfers later where at least I can walk without the support. But when I'm tired, my foot slaps a bit more, and depending on what shoe I'm wearing. So because I was very conscious of it, you know, with the publisher, I sent that as a working title. And they said, we actually really like that title. Was this just a placeholder? And I'm like, actually, I'd like the book to be called that if you guys think it's a good title. But in writing that story, in writing this book, I then realized how, in a way, it's a metaphor for being present and being conscious of what's happening around you. And like you're saying, if you're conscious of it, you can tell who's walking into a room just by their steps, if you've taken the time to just notice that.
Kojo, you've got 60 seconds before we got to let you go. So very quickly for me, I Speak is one of the chapters. And you say, for the boys who lost their fathers, knowing that they will never be seen again. What is that message to young men, to fathers out there about parenting, especially broken kids, kids who haven't been raised by mom and dad or by both parents or the right guardians?
I think it's really about, to a certain extent, we are all broken. You know, we're broken in a way. But it's not a hopeless thing. There's a way of doing the work and getting out of it, as long as we are conscious of it and we're deliberate and we're reflective, and we acknowledge that each of us is carrying certain, not necessarily burdens, but certain luggage. So that poem feels very negative, but it's also a very hopeful one, because just like I have been able to navigate, and I continue to navigate, this life, we're each doing that.
Kojo, it's been great. Thank you so much for being on the show. Kojo Bafoe, Listen to Your Footsteps, and he's the author. We appreciate his time in studio this morning. Well, up next, the